When I was growing up, I thought the Loch Ness Monster was going to be a much bigger deal than it is today. And I remember watching like Unsolved Mysteries, and they would, the eerie music to start, and then they talk about the Loch Ness Monster and how these people had seen it or whatever it is, had witnessed it, and then they go on these searches for the Loch Ness Monster in the Loch Ness, which is pretty interesting, I guess. Thought it was going to be a big deal, relatively minuscule deal in the grand scheme of things, though. Except for a guy named Steve Feltham. Steve Feltham is a guy that lives at Loch Ness. And he's lived at Loch Ness, that's the place, for about 30 years now. He sold his house, sold all of his belongings, bought a van, and now literally lives in a van down by the loch looking for the Loch Ness Monster. For 30 years, he's in this book of world records record holder for the longest continuous search for the Loch Ness Monster, which seems kind of crazy to us. I think it should seem pretty crazy to us. I don't think it's that big of a body of water, but it's real to him, and it means a lot to him. And the word that we would use for somebody like Steve is dedicated. That's dedication. That's a pretty crazy example of dedication, but that's exactly what we're talking about this morning. Dedication changes what we do. It changes how we live our lives. It changes our thoughts. It changes our focus, our purpose. It changes our behavior to where people look at it sometimes and say, that's strange, because for Steve, it really is strange. We've talked about how sometimes our lives ought to look pretty strange as well. Today, we're not talking about the Loch Ness Monster. We're talking about kids, and we're talking about parents, and we're talking about a verse that sometimes is difficult for us. In Proverbs 22:6, you read these words, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it, which sounds great, because we want to be able to train our kids up, and we want to raise our kids, and we want to have these ideas about what child raising is like and what works best. And maybe we think, I did it right, and I tried everything, and I did my dead level best to do this right. But when my child was old, he or she, they did depart from what I wanted them to do. And we wonder why. Or they did stray from the path that we wanted them to be on, and we wonder why. Did I fail? Did I do something wrong? Well, unfortunately, Proverbs 22:6 is just a proverb, which means that it is true generally in life. It's not to say that every time a child is raised correctly, they're going to turn out to be upstanding, moral Christian adults. It says generally, we get back what we put in. But I would like for us, for just a few minutes this morning, and we'll be a bit briefer in the sermon for good reason, but I want us to take a little bit of a look at what really happens in Proverbs 22, verse 6. This is the phrasing from my Bible, train up a child in the way that he should go. Your Bible may be something a bit different, raise up a child, train a child in his or her way, something like that, and when they're old, they will not depart from it. There are a lot of ways to look at that, a lot of ways that people have looked at it over the years. But let's begin with that first word, train up. I'll tell you that this is a word that is used about 3 more times in the Old Testament. The first one's in Deuteronomy 20, verse 5. The second one is in 1 Kings 8. And the third one is in 2 Chronicles chapter 5. Those last two refer to essentially the same thing. In Deuteronomy 20, verse 5, if you turn there, you would read about a man who's got a house. He's built a house. And they use the exact same word that's train up in 22:6, Proverbs. They use the same word to talk about a man who dedicates his house. You build the house, and then you dedicate that house. That's his house. That's the man's dwelling place. In 1 Kings 8 and 2 Chronicles chapter 7, you don't read about a man's house. You read about the house of God. Those are the 2 chapters where they are building the temple, and the temple is built and furnished, and it's about ready to open up, and people are going to bring their offerings and their dedications, and they're going to bring their sacrifices, and they're going to worship God together there at the temple. And the word in 1 Kings 8 and 2 Chronicles 7 is dedicate. It's the exact same word that's used in Proverbs 22, verse 6. Most of our Bibles will say something like, train up a child in the way that he should go. But the original says, dedicate. It's the same word. Nobody would look at Deuteronomy 20 and say, we are training up our house in the way that it should house us. Nobody would look at the temple and say, we are training up this house of God in the way that it's going to meet our needs and satisfy our desires. That's not what we say. We say we dedicate the house. We dedicate the temple. So if you read that with Proverbs 22:6, maybe you get a totally different understanding of what Solomon the wise man is trying to get us to say here. The meaning is to provide some sort of direction. If you talk about what we do when we dedicate something, we talk about we've kind of set it aside. It's got a purpose. We've set it apart because we know that we're going to treat this thing or this person differently. A man dedicates his house. It's not everybody else's house. It's not his neighbor's house. It's special to him. It belongs to him, and he's going to treat it differently. They dedicated the building known as the Temple of God because it was not like every other building. It was something special. They were going to do special things there. So if we're talking about what it really means to dedicate or to train up in Proverbs 22, verse 6, it's the idea of actively dedicating something or someone to a certain course of action. It means that they're not always going to get it right. They're not always going to choose the right thing, but we are actively dedicating, deciding, and committing to a certain course of action. That's where this begins. And so if we're kind of questioning what is Proverbs 22:6 about, it's about actively dedicating or committing to a certain course of action with our children. Well, what does that look like? Because if you look back at the verse as a whole, train up a child or dedicate a child in the way that he or she should go. If you look at Proverbs, there are not, a whole multitude of ways that are mentioned in the entire book of Proverbs. There are really two ways that are mentioned in Proverbs. There's the way of the wise, the way that leads to life, and the way of the fool, the way that leads to death. And so when you look at the whole context of the book, there really aren't, 50 different highways or 50 different ways that a man can travel or a person can travel. It's the way of life and wisdom, or it's the way of death and folly or foolishness. You see that throughout the book. I just picked out 4 scriptures here. One of them is right before Proverbs 22:6. Proverbs 22:5 talks about the way of a crooked versus the way of the right or the upright. And so you have this idea that there's not a whole lot of ways here. We're not talking about a lot of difficult decisions. It's really a choice between 2 ways. Am I going to choose a way that leads to life, or am I going to choose a way that leads to the opposite? Am I going to choose a way that leads to death? And so when you think about Proverbs 22:6, in light of this, that there really are only 2 ways. We're to dedicate or commit, train up a child in the way that he should go. We take everything kind of in view here. We seem to get the idea that this is a clear call for us as parents, teachers, instructors, Bible class teachers, elders, whatever, you name it. It's a clear call for us to commit to directing our children on a trajectory that leads them towards godliness. I know that's kind of a wordy way to say it, but I didn't know how to make all the words fit that I needed to make fit without doing that. It's a call for us, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, teachers, whatever, influencers of kids, to commit to direct our children on a trajectory, that word's important, towards godliness. Does that mean that I can expect that my kids are going to make every right decision? No, of course not. They're kids. Does it mean that you should be expecting your kids are never going to make a mistake if I trained them up in the right way and I set them on this course? No. They're going to make mistakes. We're all going to make mistakes. But what's important there is the word trajectory. It's a direction. It's not the end. I'm not training them up so that they make every perfect decision. It's I want them to be bent towards doing the right thing, putting them on the right path, the way that leads to life, the way that leads to wisdom, not the way that leads to death and destruction. Proverbs 22:6 is a clear call for us as parents, as teachers, grandparents, to commit to putting our children on the right path. That means that we see our kids, all kids, as full of potential. We just had, I don't know how many kids come up to the front here. And that looks great. That's a big crowd of kids. And I got to tell you, it's a huge blessing to be a part of a church that has kids like that. Great kids that my kids can be around, your kids can be around. Great idea to do that. But it means that every one of these kids that came up to the front, whether they're beginning pre-K this year, or in elementary school, or middle, or high school. Some of them are going to college. It means that they are filled with potential to choose good or to choose evil. And the responsibility on parents is to recognize that potential and set them on a trajectory, a course that leads them towards godliness. But I also want you to see that this is not just a proverb for parents. This is a proverb that calls parents and children to action. Train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Sounds great. And parents, for us, there's a clear reminder here that the things that we do early on in life, the choices that we make, the shaping that we try to provide for our kids early in their lives, they can have a permanent impact on our kids. They can have a permanent altering direction for our children. That's great. You probably knew that when you walked in this building. But for children, for kids, I want you to know that your future is somewhat shaped by your choices. Mom and dad can set you on a great course. It can put you on a great trajectory. Grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, Bible class teacher, teacher at school, whatever, can set you on a great trajectory. But your future is shaped by your choices. Proverbs is big about an adult talking to a child about choose the right way. Choose the way that leads to life. Choose the way that leads to wisdom, to making wise choices. Guard your heart. Stay on the good path. Seek wisdom in your life. That's the call of the book of Proverbs for us. The book of choices. Proverbs 22:6 is just one of those choices that we are forced to make. As parents, will we commit putting our kids on the right course, putting them on the right trajectory, to making good choices, to a life that leads to more life? For children, students, people who are going back to school during this time of year, will you commit to seeking wisdom in your life and following the good paths in life, to turning away from evil, to guarding your heart so that your choices will be right? Dedicate, commit, train. He will not depart from it. There's wisdom in that. For parents, for grandparents, for family members, for children. It's a great reminder that early decisions to get on the right track are great. But even if I don't, and even if I get off track at some point, it's still a reminder that I can turn back and make it right. In 1912, the Olympics were happening in Stockholm, Sweden. And this guy on your left here, number 344 apparently, was running in the marathon. Well, he had traveled from Japan about 5 days earlier by boat, by train. It was a pretty difficult journey. Didn't have a whole lot of time to recover from that journey, and so 5 days to recuperate from the long journey, and then he had to run the marathon. Well, about halfway through the marathon, he fell out, lost consciousness in Stockholm. A local family on the marathon route took him in, provided for him, nursed him back to health, and he was so ashamed because he couldn't go back to his home country and let them know that I failed, that I just couldn't make it. I couldn't do the marathon. I actually lost consciousness and had to be leaning on somebody else to provide the care for me. And so eventually he sneaks out of Stockholm, Sweden, and he goes back to his homeland of Japan in 1912. The Japanese government thought he was missing. They had no record of him until 54 years later. He shows up. And they realize that he had lost his way, that he fell out, that he was nursed back to health, that he was scared to go back to his country, and so he snuck out and made it back in one there. And he didn't finish the marathon. And so 54 years after 1912 Olympics, they get this guy, they take him back to the marathon race, they put him back on the course, and he starts running. I don't know exactly how old he was at that point, but he runs. And with a combined time of like 54 years, 10 hours, 8 minutes, he finishes what I think is the longest marathon in the world. commentating on it later, he said, yeah, it took me 54 years, and along the way I had 8 children and 10 grandchildren, and it's a pretty long marathon. But it's a reminder that even though I are going to, I can get back on track, and I can fulfill the role that I should. Even if I don't make it the way that I thought that I should, even if everything was right and I was set on the right path and my family put me on a good trajectory and the path was good and the direction was good and I, by my choices, got off, later on, I can still come back. Train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he's old, he may depart from it. He can still come back. Maybe today that's you. Maybe you are someone who was brought up right. Your parents did exactly what they should have done for you. They set you on the right course. They put you on the right progression. But maybe by choices, you got off track. Maybe it's been a while. Maybe not 54 years. Maybe it has been 54 years. Maybe it's time to come back on the right path and finish the race. Maybe for you, you're someone who never got off to the right start. Maybe you never had the opportunity, and there's no shame in saying that. You never had the opportunity to make that kind of choice, to make those kinds of decisions that set you up for a life that leads towards wisdom and life instead of foolishness and death. So maybe for you, it's a time to get on the right track for the first time, not to come back to it. For you today, maybe it's a clear call that you're ready to give your life to God, to submit to His way, His will for your life, not doing it your way. To turn away from a life of sin and selfishness, to turn towards a God who loves you enough to finish the race for you, to send His Son to die for you. So maybe today is the day that you want to give your life to that kind of God and submit to baptism where you are plunged into the water, your sins are washed away, and you begin this new life. You wear the name Christian when you come out of that water because you're following His steps down the right path. Maybe it's a time this morning to come back to the right path because you've strayed off of it for who knows how long. Bad decisions have taken you away, but today maybe is the day that you come back and you make it right between you and God. Maybe there are things happening in your life that we can be praying about for you right here and right now. And if you have any need this morning, why don't you come make it known while together we stand and while we sing.